The ranch stretched wide and empty beneath the pale sky, its fences leaning and its barns weathered by countless storms. It was a quiet land, as though the earth itself chose silence over noise, and in that silence lived the rancher. He was young, no, more than 25, but his shoulders carried the weight of a man twice his age. Though his body was strong from years of labor, his eyes carried a certain shyness, the kind that avoided the gaze of others and sought comfort in the rhythm of routine. His name was Ethan Carter, though most who knew of him simply called him the Quiet One. Unlike the men in town, he was not quick with words or bold with laughter. He did not linger in the saloon or join in the rowdy games of cards. Instead, his days followed a steady pattern, waking before dawn, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and working until the light faded. The ranch was all he had inherited from his father, who had died young, leaving Ethan a boy with too many responsibilities. Over the years, he had grown into a capable rancher, but the solitude had hardened around him like armor. Neighbors sometimes tried to draw him into conversation when he rode into town for supplies, but he never stayed long enough to be remembered. He wasn't unkind, far from it, but he was awkward, fumbling for words and uneasy in company. The people of town concluded that he preferred it that way, and soon they stopped trying. A man who kept to himself was easily forgotten, and Ethan quietly accepted that fate. Yet behind his silence, he carried a yearning that gnawed at him in the still hours of the night. When he sat by the fire with only the crackle of burning wood for company, his heart ached with loneliness. He dreamed sometimes of laughter echoing across the ranch, of someone's voice calling him in from the fields, of gentle hands to ease the weight of the day's burdens. But these dreams he never confessed to anyone. He could barely speak them to himself. The truth was, Ethan was untouched by love, as innocent of women as he was of the wider world beyond his fences. His mother had died when he was very young, leaving him with no guidance on matters of the heart. His father, though a good man, had been stern and practical, teaching him cattle, soil, and survival, but never tenderness. So Ethan grew into manhood shy of touch, shy of words, and even shyer of glances. If ever he looked at a woman in town, it was only when she was turned away, and if she caught his gaze, he flushed red and lowered his eyes. Despite his shyness, Ethan was not weak. There was quiet strength in him, a decency that showed in the way he treated his horses, in the patience with which he worked the land, and in the gentleness he showed even to strays that wandered onto his ranch. He never raised his voice in anger, nor his hand in cruelty. To most, he was invisible. But to those who truly looked, he was a good man who simply did not know how to bridge the distance between himself and others. The land itself mirrored his life. Vast, lonely, and unyielding, the ranch demanded all of him, but gave little back beyond survival. He had neighbors, other ranchers, cowboys passing through, townsfolk nearby, but the nearest homestead lay miles away. The silence was constant. Sometimes Ethan wondered if it would swallow him whole, yet there was comfort, too, in his solitude. No one judged him here. No one demanded words he couldn't speak. The cattle knew him by his whistle, the horses by his touch. He felt safe in the rhythm of work and silence, though deep down, he feared he would live and die without ever truly being seen. Still, the frontier had a way of surprising even the most guarded souls. It was a land where fate could change with a single encounter, where lives collided in the unlikeliest of ways. Ethan did not yet know that the world beyond his fences had already noticed him, waiting for the moment when his quiet heart would be tested. On that ranch, beneath the lonely sky, a young man lived hidden from the world, shy, kind, and utterly unaware that a single act of compassion would soon shatter his solitude forever. The night fell swiftly across the open plains, swallowing the last light of day in shades of blue and gray. Ethan Carter had been out longer than he intended, his horse moving at a steady pace as he checked the far fences. Winter was tightening its grip, and with it came a biting cold that cut through the thickest of coats. Ethan tugged his hat lower, against the wind, and urged his horse forward, eager for the warmth of his cabin fire. The world was silent but for the crunch of hooves on frosted earth. The stars glimmered faintly above, and the crescent moon hung like a lantern in the sky. Ethan had traveled these paths countless times, yet tonight something unsettled him. Perhaps it was the stillness, or the way the wind carried a faint, broken sound, like a cough or a muffled cry. He slowed his horse, his sharp eyes scanning the dark. At first he thought it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks. But then he saw her. Near the creek bed, half hidden among the bare brush, a figure sat hunched and trembling. Ethan pulled back the reins and dismounted cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The closer he came, the clearer the sight became. A young native girl, no older than 17, her clothes torn and ragged, her dark hair tangled by the wind. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, but still she shook violently. Ethan froze. He had seen natives before, traders in town, riders passing through, but never like this. She looked fragile, exhausted, as though she had wandered far and had nothing left to give. Her lips were blue, her cheeks hollow, and though her eyes flicked toward him in fear, she did not run. She was too weak even to move. Ethan's first instinct was hesitation. His father had always warned him to be careful, to keep distance when it came to tribal matters. Trouble, he had called it. Trouble a man couldn't untangle himself from. But Ethan was not his father. He looked at the girl and saw not trouble, but suffering. He took a slow step forward, speaking gently, though he wasn't sure she would understand. "You'll freeze out here," he said, his voice low. "You need warmth." She flinched, her eyes narrowing with mistrust. Ethan stopped, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. He knew no words of her tongue, and she likely knew few of his, but kindness did not always need translation. Carefully, Ethan slipped off his heavy coat, the one lined with wool, that had carried him through many winters. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling the sting of cold bite at his own skin. But then he walked closer and crouched, holding the jacket out to her. The girl's eyes widened. She did not reach for it at once, watching him with suspicion as though expecting some hidden trick. Ethan did not push it into her hands. Instead, he simply held it out and waited, his gaze steady, his face soft. Finally, with trembling fingers, she accepted it. The jacket was far too large for her small frame, but as she pulled it around her shoulders, it seemed to swallow her, in warmth. She clutched it tightly, her breathing still uneven but steadier than before. Ethan remained crouched, unsure of what to say or do. He had helped, but what now? Could he bring her to his cabin? Would her people think he meant her harm? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he didn't move. He only watched her, as though waiting for her to decide. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the shy rancher and the shivering girl, two strangers bound by circumstance. She did not speak, but her eyes softened. A flicker of gratitude, faint but unmistakable, passed between them. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment ended. The girl pulled the coat tighter and with surprising strength rose to her feet. She swayed but steadied herself, giving Ethan one last look, long and searching as if memorizing him. Without a word, she turned and slipped into the shadows of the trees. Ethan stood, uncertain whether to follow or let her go. His instinct told him to chase after her, to make sure she was safe, but something in her gaze had been final. She had chosen her path. All he could do was watch her vanish into the wilderness, the sound of her steps fading until the night swallowed her whole. Left alone by the creek, Ethan felt the weight of the cold settle on his shoulders where the coat had once been. He climbed back onto his horse, his mind restless. Had he done enough? Would she survive? Questions he could not answer churned inside him as he rode home. The memory of her trembling form burned into his thoughts. When Ethan reached his cabin, the fire offered warmth, but it could not ease the strange ache in his chest. He replayed the moment again and again. The fear in her eyes, the way she had clutched his jacket, the silence between them that somehow felt louder than words. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel entirely alone. Yet he also did not feel at peace. Something had changed out there by the creek, something he could not name. He could not know it then, but that single act of kindness had set into motion a chain of events that would alter his quiet life forever. The next morning broke cold and pale. Frost rimed the windows of Ethan's cabin, and the horizon glowed faintly with the promise of sun. Ethan stirred from an uneasy sleep, his thoughts still tangled with the image of the girl he had found the night before. Every detail returned to him with sharp clarity. The way her hands had trembled, the haunted look in her eyes, the way she had clutched his jacket as if it were her last hope against the cold. He rose, lit the fire, and moved through his morning. Chores, but his heart was elsewhere. As he fed the cattle, his gaze kept drifting toward the creek bed in the distance. He wondered if she had made it through the night. He wondered if she still had the strength to walk. The thought of her out there alone and vulnerable gnawed at him until he had to grip the fence rail just to steady himself. The rancher had lived his life by routines, chores, fences, fields, cattle, everything measured, predictable. Yet this single encounter had unsettled him, leaving him restless in his own skin. He knew deep down that he would never see her again. And yet, by midday, Ethan rode out to check the land near the creek. The frost crunched under his horse's hooves as he approached the place where he had found her. The brush was still bent where she had sat, the earth marked by faint impressions of her presence. But she was gone. No footprints led a way that he could follow. The ground was too hard, too cold. All that remained was silence. He dismounted and stood for a long while scanning the tree line. It was foolish, he knew, to hope she might still be near. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that her absence meant something more than a passing stranger. That evening, when he returned home, Ethan built his fire higher than usual. The cabin's warmth wrapped around him, but it did not soothe the hollow feeling in his chest. He sat in his chair, staring at the flames, replaying the moment when she had pulled his jacket around herself. Her eyes had spoken louder than words, gratitude, fear, and something else he couldn't name. For years, Ethan had been invisible, unnoticed by the world. Yet for that single heartbeat of time, the girl had looked at him as though he mattered. As though his simple act of kindness carried weight beyond what he understood. It was a strange comfort. He told himself she had likely returned to her people, that she was safe now, and that was enough. But part of him wished he had said something more, anything at all that could have bridged the distance between them. Instead, he had stood silent. As always, his words locked inside. Over the next days, Ethan tried to push the memory aside. There were fences to mend, cattle to tend, supplies to haul from town. Life demanded his attention, but no matter how busy his hands were, his thoughts strayed back to the girl. Sometimes he caught himself scanning the hills as though expecting to see her slight figure appear on the horizon. Other times, he woke in the night with the sensation that she was still near, watching from the shadows. The truth was, she had left something behind. Not an object, but a feeling. A quiet connection that lingered long after her footsteps had faded. Ethan didn't know her name, or her story, or even if she had survived the bitter night. But he knew he would never forget the way she had held his jacket close, as if clinging not just to warmth, but to hope itself. And though she was Gone, she had given him something in return, something he couldn't quite define. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. She had seen him. For a man who had lived most of his life unnoticed, that silent acknowledgement was a gift greater than he realized. What Ethan could not know was that the girl, too, had not forgotten. As she vanished into the forest, she carried with her not only his jacket, but the memory of his face, his hesitant kindness, his quiet strength. To her, his act was no small thing. It was a rare offering of compassion from a settler to one of her people, and it stirred something deep within her that she could not ignore. In the days to come, her gratitude would speak louder than words. And soon, Ethan would discover that his single shy gesture had rippled far beyond that cold night by the creek, for now he sat alone in his cabin, unaware that his life was already changing. He believed the girl had gone and that he would never see her again. But fate had other plans. Gratitude, silent and unseen, was already riding toward him, an answer he never expected, carried on the hooves of 200 warriors. The following week brought Ethan into town. Supplies were running low: flour, kerosene, salt, and a coil of wire for the fence that had given him trouble. Though he dreaded the trip, it was necessary. The ranch could not run on solitude alone. He set out early, the chill morning air biting at his cheeks as his horse carried him across the flat, empty miles. The town sat nestled against the low hills, its wooden storefronts and dust-worn streets, slowly stirring to life. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang faintly in the distance. Ethan dismounted outside the general store, tied his horse, and pulled his hat lower. Trips into town always left him feeling exposed. People greeted each other with ease here, traded stories, laughed at jokes, argued loudly. Ethan never seemed to fit. He preferred the quiet of his ranch, but sometimes necessity outweighed preference. Inside, the store smelled of flour, leather, and tobacco. Mr. Harper, the shopkeeper, nodded politely when Ethan entered, but did not press him for conversation. Ethan filled his basket in silence, choosing each item carefully. He was nearly finished when he noticed a change in the room. The low murmur of voices had taken on a sharper edge, the kind that carried both fear and curiosity. Two men leaned near the counter, speaking in urgent tones. Ethan caught fragments as he walked past. Warriors spotted north of the river. Must be 200, maybe more. They're gathering for something. Ethan paused, his back stiffening. He lingered near a barrel of nails, pretending to inspect them as he listened. Could be a raid, one man muttered, his eyes darting nervously. You know how it goes. First they circle, then they strike. Best to be ready. Mr. Harper frowned. Or it could be nothing. Don't go stirring panic. The tribes have kept to themselves lately. Another voice cut in, sharp and bitter. You're a fool if you think they don't want our land. They're just waiting for an excuse. The men fell into heavy silence. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He remembered the girl, the way she had shivered, the way she had clutched his coat like it was life itself. Could these rumors be connected to her? Had her people seen his gesture as kindness or as intrusion? He left the store quickly, paid in silence, and loaded his supplies onto the horse. But as he walked through the street, the whispers followed. Him. A group of ranchers huddled outside the saloon, their voices low but urgent. Words like retaliation, scouts, and trouble brewing drifted through the cold air. Mothers pulled children closer, and men carried their rifles openly. The whole town seemed on edge, as though it held its breath. Ethan rode out of town with unease pressing heavy on his chest. The further he got from the murmurs and fear, the clearer his thoughts became. He could not shake the image of warriors gathered at the horizon, silent and watchful. Were they truly preparing for violence, Or were they simply protecting their own after years of being treated with mistrust and cruelty? His mind returned again and again to the girl. She had disappeared into the woods with his jacket. Perhaps she had told her people of him. Perhaps they now knew of the shy rancher who had offered warmth to a stranger. But what would they make of it? Would they see it as a gesture of goodwill or as something else entirely? By the time Ethan reached his ranch, the sun was sinking low, and shadows stretched long across the fields. He unloaded his supplies mechanically, but his thoughts churned. He had always believed his life too quiet, too small to touch the world, beyond his fences. Yet now it felt as if unseen eyes were watching him from every ridge, waiting. That night, he sat by the fire, his rifle propped against the wall. He wasn't a man quick to violence, nor did he imagine himself a fighter, but the fear that had swept through town clung to him. He could almost hear the whisper of hooves in the distance, feel the weight of something approaching, and though he tried to convince himself otherwise, a strange certainty grew inside him. His act of kindness had not gone unnoticed. The silence of gratitude he had felt in the girl's eyes was about to break. The world beyond his solitude was stirring, and it was riding closer with every passing day. The night was restless. Ethan tossed beneath his blankets, waking often to the faint howl of coyotes and the shifting groans of the winter wind against the cabin walls. Every creak of wood sounded louder, sharper, like a warning he couldn't name. He rose once to stir the fire, then again to check the latch on the door. It was foolish, he told himself. Nothing was out there but the usual silence. And yet sleep refused him. By the time dawn edged across the horizon, pale and cold, Ethan was already awake. He sat in the chair near the fire, boots still on, hat tilted low over weary eyes. The first rays of sunlight stretched long across the plains, casting shadows that seemed to move and breathe. It was then he heard it. At first, only a faint, rhythmic tremor in the earth. His head lifted, heart thudding. He strained his ears. The sound grew, hooves. Not one, not a handful, but many. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. Ethan rose quickly, crossing the cabin in 3 strides. He pulled open the door, the sharp morning air striking his face. His eyes scanned the horizon, and what he saw froze him where he stood, lined along his fence, stretching farther than he could see in both directions, were riders. Native warriors. 200, perhaps more, their horses stamping and snorting clouds into the frosty air. Their bodies were painted, feathers woven into their hair, weapons gleaming faintly in the rising sun. They were silent, unnervingly so, a wall of stillness and power that made the very air heavy. Ethan's breath caught. He had never seen so many gathered at once. The stories from town rang in his ears, whispers of raids, warnings of bloodshed. His pulse hammered in his throat. He gripped the doorframe, torn between slamming it shut and forcing himself to stand still. The warriors did not move. They did not shout, nor brandish their weapons. They only watched, every eye fixed on him. Their horses shifted restlessly, but their riders were statues, waiting. Ethan's first thought was of the girl. He saw her again in his mind's eye, hunched by the creek, trembling in the cold, wrapping herself in his coat. Was this because of her? Had she returned to her people with tales of a rancher who had crossed some unspoken line? Or had his gesture been taken as offense, a violation of custom he did not understand? Fear gripped him tighter than any winter frost. He had no words, no plan, no understanding of what they wanted. He was only one man, shy and unarmed save for the rifle leaning uselessly against the cabin wall. Against such a gathering, the rifle might as well have been a twig. Minutes stretched long. His breath plumed in the cold as he stood at the threshold, every muscle taut, his mind racing. If they had come for war, he would already be dead. That much was clear, but they hadn't moved. They were waiting, for what he could not tell. At last, from among their ranks, a figure emerged. A single rider moved forward, slow and deliberate. His horse was black, its mane braided with leather ties. The man upon it was older, his face lined with years, his bearing one of unmistakable authority. He carried no weapon in hand, though a long spear was strapped to his back. His gaze never wavered from Ethan as he approached. The silence was unbearable. Ethan's throat went dry. His instincts urged him to speak, to break the tension, but what words could bridge such a gulf? He could only stand, watching the elder rider draw nearer until he halted at the fence line. The warrior's eyes studied him for a long time, eyes sharp, unreadable, as though measuring the very soul of the rancher before him. Ethan's chest tightened under the weight of that gaze. He wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the safety of his cabin, yet something in him held firm. Perhaps it was pride, or stubbornness, or simply the knowledge that running now would end whatever fragile chance existed in this moment. The elder raised one hand and spoke a few words in his tongue, his voice deep, steady. Ethan could not understand, but the sound carried authority, not threat. Behind him, the 200 warriors remained silent, like a wall of judgment waiting for the next move. Ethan's mind whirled. He knew nothing of their language, their customs, yet he felt, somehow, that this moment was not about weapons or war. It was about him, about what he would do next. The shy rancher stood in the doorway of his lonely cabin, heart pounding, caught between fear and courage. By dawn, the quiet life he had always known had ended. 200 warriors had surrounded. His land and their silence demanded an answer. The elder rider's hand fell to his side, and silence hung heavier than ever. Ethan stood frozen at the doorway, uncertain if he should step forward or retreat. The cold air burned in his lungs, and the sight of 200 warriors stretched across his fence gnawed at every nerve in his body. Then, movement rippled through the ranks. A rider shifted. Another eased his horse aside. Slowly, as though the moment had been rehearsed, the warriors parted to let someone through. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A smaller figure emerged from their midst, riding bareback on a dun-colored horse. The others gave way with respect, their heads tilting slightly as she passed. She was no ordinary member of the group. This much was clear from the way the line, shifted for her. And then Ethan saw her face. His breath caught in his chest. It was her, the girl from the creek, the one he had given his jacket to. She rode forward slowly, the horse's steps light upon the frozen ground. The oversized jacket was still wrapped around her small frame, its wool collar turned up to shield her from the wind. She looked stronger than the night he had found her back straight, her chin lifted, but the memory of her trembling form was still fresh in Ethan's mind. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to vanish, the wind, the warriors, even the rising sun. There was only the girl and the rancher, two souls bound by a single act of kindness. Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. What could he say to her, here, before all her people? He had barely managed words the night he gave her his coat. The girl dismounted with quiet grace, sliding down from the horse and walking toward the fence. The warriors behind her remained still, watching intently. Ethan realized with a jolt that all their eyes were not on him alone. They were on her. She was the thread between them, the bridge that had brought two worlds face to face. She stopped just short of the fence line, no more than a dozen paces from where Ethan stood. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, she reached up and touched the edge of his jacket, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. Her lips parted. At first, only a whisper came, too soft for him to hear. She tried again, her voice trembling but stronger now. "You gave this." The words were halting, her English rough, but Ethan understood. Relief and wonder swept through him. She remembered. She had not forgotten. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice low and steady despite the storm in his chest. It was cold. "You needed it." The girl studied him, her dark eyes full of something Ethan couldn't name. "Gratitude, yes, but more than that." She turned then, speaking quickly in her own tongue to the elder who had ridden forward earlier. Her voice carried confidence now, nothing like the fragile silence of that night by the creek. She gestured toward Ethan, her hand pressing to the jacket, then spreading outward as if to say, "This was kindness." The elder listened without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. When she finished, he looked back at Ethan, his eyes narrowing as though searching the truth of the girl's words in the rancher's very soul. Ethan swallowed hard. He felt suddenly bare, stripped of defenses. He had no weapons, no allies, nothing but the honesty in his heart. Yet as the girl turned back to him, standing in his jacket before 200 warriors, Ethan felt something stir inside, a flicker of courage he had never known before. He had been invisible his whole life. The quiet rancher no one noticed. But here, now, he mattered. His simple gesture had carried weight, more than he ever intended, more than he could yet understand. The girl's presence was proof of that. She had returned, not as a frightened stranger by the creek, but as a voice for her people. And through her, Ethan realized, his fate was no longer his alone. The silence of the warriors lingered, thick and waiting. The girl stood firm, her small frame wrapped in the oversized jacket, her eyes locked on Ethan as if daring him to falter. This was no accident. She had brought him into the center of something greater than himself, and whether he was ready or not, Ethan Carter was about to learn that kindness could ripple outward like a stone cast into still water, touching shores he had never dreamed of. The girl's words still hung in the cold air when the elder rider shifted in his saddle. His gaze swept over Ethan like a blade, sharp, heavy, unrelenting. Then, with a slow movement, he dismounted. The ground seemed to tremble as his boots struck the frozen earth. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hair streaked by years of age. Feathers and beads adorned his braids, and across his chest hung a necklace of carved bone. His face bore the lines of wisdom and burden, and when, his eyes fixed on Ethan, the rancher felt stripped bare, as if the man could see straight through him. The elder stepped closer to the fence, and a younger man, clearly a translator, moved beside him. The elder spoke, his voice deep and measured, the words rolling with weight. When he finished, the translator turned to Ethan. "He asks," the young man said, "why you gave her your coat." Ethan's mouth went dry. He hadn't expected the question to be so direct. He shifted uneasily, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "She was cold," he answered after a pause. His voice was steady but soft. "I didn't want her to suffer." The elder spoke again, quicker this time, his expression hard. The translator's tone sharpened. He asks, "Was it pity? Did you see her as weak beneath you? Or was it true kindness?" Ethan's chest tightened. The weight of the warrior's silence pressed down on him. 200 eyes, unmoving, fixed on the quiet rancher, who had spent his life avoiding the gaze of others. Now, there was no place to hide. Ethan began, then faltered. His natural shyness threatened to choke him, to steal the words from his mouth. For a fleeting second, he thought of retreat, of letting silence be his answer. But the girl was watching him, her eyes fierce, urging him without a word. He drew in a slow breath, lifting his head at last. His voice, though quiet, carried across the still air. "It wasn't pity," he said. I've lived out here long enough to know the cold can kill a man. Or a girl. I didn't want that for her. Not because she was less, because no one should. Freeze alone. The translator relayed his words, and the elder's face remained unreadable. Ethan pressed on, surprising even himself. I don't have much. I'm not a man of speeches or wealth, but I know what it is to feel alone. If my coat could spare her that, just a little, then it was the right thing to do. When the words left him, silence followed. Ethan felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He had never spoken so openly before, not even to himself. He waited, unsure if his answer would be enough. The elder regarded him for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he turned his gaze to the girl. She stepped forward, speaking quickly in her tongue, her voice carrying conviction. Ethan couldn't understand the words, but he understood the way she stood. Tall, unflinching, proud. She was defending him. The elder listened without interruption, then turned back to Ethan. His eyes softened, just slightly, but enough to be seen. He spoke again, and this time his words came with a slow nod. The translator relayed. He says many settlers see our people as less than human. But you gave without demand, without insult. He says your words are simple, but true. He believes you speak from the heart. A low murmur rippled through the warriors. Approval, or at least recognition. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but the test was not finished. The elder stepped closer to the fence, his voice rising like distant thunder. The translator's eyes flicked nervously before he spoke. He asks, would you do the same again? If it were any of us in need? Or was this one act a chance moment? The question pierced deep. Ethan's gaze swept across the sea of warriors, the weight of their scrutiny pressing against his chest. Then he looked at the girl, still wrapped in his coat, her dark eyes locked onto his. Yes, Ethan said firmly. The word rang with certainty. I'd do it again. For her. For anyone. Not because of who they are, but because it's right. The translator repeated the words, and this time the elder's stern face broke into the faintest trace of a smile. He lifted his chin, speaking one final phrase. The translator nodded. He says you are not like the others. He says you are different, and that difference may matter. The tension in the air shifted. The wall of silence began to feel less like a threat, and more like a judgment that had been passed. Ethan's heart eased, though the pounding in his chest reminded him how close he had stood to the edge. The test of character was done, and though Ethan had never sought such a trial, he had faced it, and against all odds, passed. The stillness that followed the elder's final words was different from the silence that had greeted Ethan at dawn. Before, it had been heavy with suspicion, with the weight of an entire people waiting to judge him. Now, though the quiet lingered, it was charged with something else, expectation. The girl remained by the fence, the oversized jacket still draped over her shoulders. Her eyes never left Ethan, urging him forward, as though she knew the moment was not yet complete. The elder had tested his heart. Yes, but the people needed to hear his truth not through a translator, not through careful questions, but from him, raw and unshaped. Ethan realized then that he could not stay half-hidden in the shadow of his porch. He had lived his life ducking from eyes, avoiding words, keeping the world at arm's length. But now, if ever there was a time to speak plain, it was this moment. He drew in a breath, steadying himself, and stepped down from the porch. His boots crunched against the frost-hardened earth, every step sounding far too loud in the hush of 200 warriors. He stopped at the fence, his hands gripping the rough wood rail, the distance between him and the girl no more than a span. For a long heartbeat, he said nothing. The translator waited. The warriors waited. Even the wind seemed to pause. Finally, Ethan lifted his head. His voice was quiet, but carried in the still air. "I ain't a man of words," he began, his tone thick with honesty. "I've spent my life out here with cattle and land, not people. Talking never came easy to me, but I reckon some things don't need fancy words." He glanced at the girl, then back to the elder. "When I saw her by the creek, she looked cold, scared, and alone. I know what that feels like, being alone. Folks don't often look twice at me, don't ask after me. Truth is, most days I ain't sure anyone even remembers I'm here. So when I saw her, it wasn't pity I felt. It was recognition, like seeing a piece of myself." The words came slowly, but they came, each one carrying more weight than Ethan realized he had in him. His shyness was still there, but it no longer bound his tongue. The truth loosened him. "I didn't think about who she was, or where she came from," he continued. "Didn't think about what it might mean. I just knew she was cold, and I had a coat. And what good's a coat if it don't keep someone warm?" A faint murmur stirred in the line of warriors. Ethan wasn't sure if it was agreement or surprise, but he pressed on. "I ain't rich. I ain't important. I ain't got a family waiting at my table. But if the only thing I leave in this world is that someone was a little less cold one night because of me, then that's enough." He paused, his hands tightening on the fence rail. His throat ached with the effort of speaking, but his chest felt lighter. He turned to the girl again. "She reminded me that even a quiet man's actions matter, and I'd do it again, for her or for any of you, without expecting a thing in return." The translator's voice rose and fell, carrying Ethan's words into the language of the gathered warriors. Each phrase was echoed across the crowd, their heads turning, their eyes fixed on him. Ethan stood still, his hat shading his eyes, but he did not shrink. For once in his life, he let himself be fully seen. When the translation ended, the silence returned. But it was no longer a silence of judgment. It was reverent, contemplative, as though the weight of his words had settled deep into the hearts of those who listened. The elder's expression shifted, the hard lines of his face easing into something softer, almost approving. The girl's lips curved into the faintest smile, pride and relief mingling in her gaze. And for Ethan, for the shy rancher who had always believed his life was too small to matter, it felt like stepping out of the shadows into the open for the very first time. In the quiet dawn, surrounded by a sea of warriors, Ethan Carter's voice had finally found its place. For a long moment after Ethan's words faded, nothing stirred. The frost on the fence glistened, the girl's breath misted in the dawn air, and 200 warriors sat unmoving upon their horses. Ethan felt the weight of that silence pressing on him like a mountain. He wondered if he had spoken too much, or not enough. Then at last the elder raised his hand. The warriors shifted, their horses stamping the ground, releasing the pent-up tension that had hung like a storm cloud over the ranch. The elder's deep voice rolled out, steady and commanding. The translator quickly followed, his words sharp against the morning air. "He says your honesty has been heard. Your heart has been seen. Now their people will answer in kind." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure of what was to come. His fingers tightened against the rail, his pulse a drum in his ears. The elder turned to the girl, speaking in their language. She nodded, stepped forward, and spoke for herself. Though Ethan could not understand her words, her voice carried the rhythm of truth. She gestured toward the jacket around her shoulders, then to Ethan, then to the warriors behind her. Each phrase was punctuated with conviction. The elder listened, his face solemn, then raised his hand again. He barked a command. What followed nearly stole Ethan's breath. The front line of warriors dismounted as one. Boots struck the earth in a rhythm. That seemed almost ceremonial. Then another line followed, and another, until dozens stood tall before the fence. In silence, they formed a wall of humanity, strong, unyielding, united. Ethan braced himself, unsure whether this was threat or honor. The translator stepped closer. "They come forward not to harm you," he said. "They come to show you respect." Ethan blinked. Respect? For him? A man who had spent most of his life forgotten on the edge of town? The thought seemed unreal. The elder strode closer to the fence, closing the distance until only a few paces remained between him and Ethan. His eyes bore into the rancher, but now the fire in them was tempered with something else. Acknowledgement. He says, the translator spoke carefully, that one act can reveal the truth of a man. To give without demand, to help without shame. These are signs of honor, and honor is rare among the settlers. The elder's voice rose again, the words rolling with strength. The translator continued. He says you gave warmth when others would have given nothing. You saw a girl, not a burden. A life, not a stranger. That makes you different, and difference matters. Ethan felt a strange tightness in his throat. He wanted to speak, to deny being anything special, but for once he held his tongue. This was their moment, not his. The warriors, still lined before the fence, bowed there, heads in unison. Not deep, not submissive, but a gesture of recognition, from one people to another. The sound of hundreds of braids and feathers shifting filled the still air. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. He had never been bowed to in his life, not by townsfolk, not by anyone. He was a quiet man, invisible more often than not. And now here he stood, receiving a gesture of respect from 200 warriors. The girl stepped closer, her hand brushing the wood rail between them. She looked at Ethan with a softness that spoke louder than any words. Gratitude, pride, and something deeper. A trust being born in that very moment. The elder spoke again, his voice strong, final. The translator's eyes flicked to Ethan. He says you have gained something rare. You have gained their attention, and with it, their trust. He says this is not the end, but the beginning of what must follow. Ethan frowned faintly, confusion stirring. The beginning? What more could there be? He had given a coat, spoken his heart, and been judged. What else did they want of him? But he sensed it in the way the elder spoke, in the murmur of the warriors, behind him. This gathering was not only about a coat, not only about kindness. There was more to come, and Ethan would soon learn why 200 warriors had truly come to stand at his fence. The elder's words hung in the air like smoke after, a fire curling into silence that felt heavier than before. Ethan stood frozen at the fence, his mind still struggling to catch up with all that had happened. Respect, trust, the beginning of something greater. For a man who had spent his life blending into the background, the thought seemed almost impossible. Girl stepped forward again, her hand resting lightly on the rough wood between them. Though her words were in her own tongue, the translator quickly gave them breath in English. She says, "Your act was not just kindness to her. It was seen as a sign. Among her people, when the land grows harsh and storms gather, they look for small sparks, proof that goodness still walks in the world. Your coat was that spark." Ethan's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but all he managed was a nod. His voice had carried earlier, but now the weight of what she said pressed down in a way that stole his words. The elder lifted his chin, speaking with measured power. The translator relayed, "He says their people did not ride here to test you, alone. They came to decide if there is still room for understanding between the ranchers and the native tribes. Too much has been taken, too much forgotten. But one act, one coat, showed that not all hearts are closed." Ethan blinked, his hand tightening on the fence. "You mean they came here to—" His voice trailed, uncertain. The translator gave a slow nod. To choose. To decide if they would treat you as enemy or as brother. The words hit Ethan harder than any bullet ever could. 200 warriors had not surrounded his land for vengeance or for conquest. They had come to measure the worth of one quiet man's soul. The elder raised his arm then, and every warrior in the field struck their chest with a closed fist. The sound a rolling thunder across the ranch. Not a war cry. Not a threat. A vow. The translator's voice trembled with the weight of it as he spoke. They offer you an unspoken pact. You gave warmth without asking. Now they give protection without demand. Your land, your cattle, your life. It will not be touched. By their hand, nor by those who would harm you unjustly. You are under their eye. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. Protection? From them? His mind reeled. He had never sought such a thing, never imagined it possible. He was just a rancher. Just a man with a coat and a heart too shy to face the world. But as he looked at the warriors before him, he saw no jest in their faces. Their stance was solemn, proud, binding. This was their way of honoring what they saw as sacred. The girl smiled then, faint but certain. She touched the jacket again, pulling it tighter around her shoulders as if reminding him of how it had all begun. A simple act, a forgotten jacket, had turned into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Ethan finally found his voice hoarse and uneven. I ain't sure I deserve all this, he said softly. But I'll try to live in a way that honors it. The translator conveyed his words, and the elder gave a rare smile, brief but unmistakable. Then, with a commanding gesture, he turned his horse. One by one, the warriors remounted, their movements fluid and practiced. The thunder of hooves soon filled the valley as line after line rode away, leaving the ranch as swiftly as they had arrived. Within minutes, the sea of warriors had become a distant blur against the horizon. Only the girl lingered, her eyes on Ethan, her lips curving in a look that held both gratitude and promise. She pressed a hand against her heart, then to the jacket, and finally toward him, a silent vow of her own. Then she, too, turned and followed the others. The ranch was quiet. Once more, the frost still clung to the fence. The cattle grazed as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Ethan stood alone, staring at the empty horizon. For the first time in his life, he did not feel invisible. His smallness had become strength. His silence had spoken louder than words, and his kindness had lit a flame that reached across a divide older than himself. The shy rancher who once thought he had no place in the world now bore the unseen shield of 200 warriors, not through force, not through fear, but through one simple, unshaken truth. Compassion, even in the smallest act, can change the course of everything.